Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Cold Fusion Summit. I want to take a moment and thank Adobe for providing these resources and these talks for you all. I hope you've been enjoying your day. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Coralie Rosario. I'm a senior UX designer. Been working in the video game industry for about a little more than 8 years now, currently at Niantic. I've also worked on apps, web, and a couple AR products. And today I am going to be talking a little bit about just best UX practices in games and AR. Sometimes I'm going to be combining both. Super quick clarification. I have worked mainly on mobile, so I will not be talking about console today. And same goes for AR. Most of the products I've worked on have been on mobile, but I will be providing all of you so many different examples of things that are out there and best strategies and guides. So let's start. So when we do talk about user experience or UX, we are talking about the overall experience of a person using a product. It could be a website, an app, a game. It can be an AR experience, VR, XR. It could even be a physical product, such as a chair or headphones. But it is the overall experience of using that product or that item, especially, in terms of how easy or pleasing it is to use. When we talk about this, we are talking both about the feelings and these sort of associations we make when we're using the product, as well as the visuals. So with UX, those things are completely tied together. They're not separate. And when we talk about UX, foundationally, there are some items that kind of guide us when we are covering these products. We are looking at how useful they would be for folks that are out there, how they would use these things, how usable, how is the product itself? Is it something that is easy for me to pick up, use in my daily life? Is it something that's desirable? Is this a product that I actually even want as a user? Does it fill some sort of need for me? Is it findable? Can I easily find the product and find things within the product, especially if it's an app, a website, any sort of like digital product? Is it something valuable, something that brings value to me as a user? Is it something that's, improving my life? Not all things have to be, life improving. Like games are, well, some games are life improving, but games can just be for entertainment value. But is this product enhancing value in my life? And is it here and I'm using it for a specific purpose? Is it a product that's credible? Is it something that I feel I can trust? And the way that I'm using it and playing it and maybe spending my energy or my cash, my money, or the information that it's kind of tracking of me. Is it using it in safe ways for me and respecting my privacy? And is it also respecting the brand of the product as well? And is it accessible? Is it something that no matter the disability that you may have, it's something you could still use? And it accounts for all the different barriers that we would be creating accidentally for people who can't use our products, and bypassing that. The other thing we use to evaluate or guide us when we are creating products is a usability heuristics. This is a list, again, this is a guide, a list of all the different things we need to account for when we are creating a product that's digital in this case, and bridging it to whoever's going to be using it. So, being able to communicate a player's status or a user status within a game or an app, if they have energy, if they have resources, if there's feedback coming at them. Is there some sort of match between the system and the real world? Are the words that you're using in this app or in this product something that anyone, no matter the age, that doesn't know anything about development can easily understand what it means, versus using linguistics or using lingo that's more on the development side. Likewise is the products that you have in there, things that they can easily recognize and manipulate the way that they would a physical object that they might know. Are you allowing users the ability to control their experience and the freedom to do what they like, including error prevention in case they make some sort of mistake, they can backtrack and things? Are you making sure that you're being consistent and you're using standards? Is, for example, you have a style guide and you're following that style guide, or you have certain gestures that you use throughout your game, but then all of a sudden you have a feature that you're using another gesture. Why are you using that gesture there and it's not used anywhere else? That means that the player has to then learn this new interaction. Any sort of error prevention, letting the player know what types of errors are happening and letting them be able to navigate those errors, be it you don't have Wi-Fi, you need to connect to the Wi-Fi, or you lost your data, data access, that's what I mean. Yeah, and then leaning into recognition over recall. Our memories are fallible. We unfortunately can't remember every single detail of every single thing that we play. So allowing players to recognize objects and recognize the potential of how to use that versus, falling onto their memory is the guide there. Is it a system that's flexible and efficient to use? There's not many taps that, to get to your goal. It's just, a few taps and that's it. Is it aesthetically pleasing? And is it minimal? Is it something, especially on the UI side, and especially for games, we want to be able sometimes to show everything that a player can do. Contextual design is incredibly important when it comes to video games, and showing different types of information and different types of UI, depending on what the player is doing, should be the way to go versus just having everything on the screen at the same time. Can you help users just recognize, diagnose, recover from errors very easily? And lastly, is there any sort of access to help and documentation, help desk or help shift, or some sort of forum, anywhere that they can just find the issue that they're experiencing and troubleshoot it? And I get this question a lot. So UX and UI, they're the same thing, right? And my answer is not really. They do both require creative thinking, and they both are kind of just two sides of the same coin. However, UX is more focused on the player's overall experience. We are very player or user-centered when we're designing. We are looking at the information, the architecture of the information that we're presenting the player and how we're organizing and categorizing that information. We are looking at the interaction on the screens. What do these buttons do? Where is it going to take me? What kind of feedback am I going to get from tapping a button or completing a certain action? When we are designing directly, like doing any sort of visual design, we are leaning more into wireframes and prototypes. A lot of times it's very gray boxed, it's very simple, or low fidelity, lo-fi. We are doing a lot of user research and doing market analysis, bringing in personas, user stories, to try to contextualize who we're building this for. We cover a lot of scenarios and different ways that different people would use this game or this product, why they would use it that way in order to meet their just their goals and their purpose and what it is that they're trying to achieve. It's very focused on the process and methodology side of designing. A lot of critical thinking is involved in a lot of problem solving as well. Like, that's our bread and butter. We just problem solve all the time. Whereas UI, we are focusing more on the overall visual design of things. There's, your color theory, your shape and form, typography, layout, how the brain looks at visual information and how we organize and create a hierarchy, depending on what we want to focus on first or read first or emphasize first. UI is creating more high fidelity mockups. They're creating assets. There's a lot of very foundational visual communication principles and practices that UI specifically focuses on. It is more about convergent thinking, all these different aspects coming together to feed into this one way of presenting information. And it does focus generally more on the client rather than the user. It's more, what does the client want us to achieve? And that's where UX and UI really, really work very well together. We are a bridge between what our devs want, what our stakeholders want, and what our players need, and what kind of goals they're reaching. We're the ones that are communicating between those two things. And UI and UX work very, very closely together. Sometimes it's the same person. In my case, I usually work with a UI designer on the games that I've worked on. So now that we're talking about UI a little bit, I wanted to show how UI is represented in different games and AR and the different types of UI. When we talk about games, we are looking at a game's narrative. What's the story that it's trying to tell, either through visuals or through the actual progression of the game. What is the game's space? And then within these, we have different types of UI. We have meta, diegetic, and spatial. Outside of these two game's narrative and game space, we also have one that doesn't have anything to do with these two spaces, non-diegetic UI. When we talk about diegetic UI, we are talking about any sort of UI that's going to be found within the game's space and narrative. So classic example is Dead Space. A lot of the UI is diegetic, meaning that it's in the environment of the game. It's probably it's UI or VFX or anything that's in the game. And it's something that the character can very realistically be seeing as they're in the game, rather than you seeing it and them not engaging with it. With Dead Space, whenever you would bring up your inventory or controller, you would see the inventory pop up in the UI, and the character actually looks at that element. So it's in the space, it's in the narrative, it's something that looks like it belongs there. Spatial is within the game, but maybe not necessarily part of the narrative. We see this a lot with any sort of MOBA that has special buffs or any sort of special effect or ability that would be attached to a character. It could be a shine. It could be a sort of UI, like that circle UI element on the floor in this image. It's in the world, but it doesn't really fit in what's going on. And chances are, if the character were, perceptive of what's going on, they wouldn't even see it because it's not part of what they're experiencing. It's something that's an indication for us as players. In AR, we see this a little bit more as arrows or indicators, especially with Google Maps. They're elements that are letting us know where we need to go, but maybe they don't really fit in the style or narrative of the game. I know with Google Maps it's a little bit different because it is the UI is much simpler and it's very specific to the brand. But there's no real narrative to it. With meta, it's things that are not necessarily in the game's narrative, in the game's narrative, but not necessarily in the game space. Very classic example for this is if you're playing a first-person shooter and you get hit, your health goes down. Instead of having a health bar that measures how much health you've lost, you actually see instead blood spatter on the screen. And it's in theme with what's going on because, people are running around with guns and stuff. But it eventually goes away. And other times we also see kind of the screen turn a little bit red. Again, it's themed around the game itself, but it's not in the space necessarily. It's on the HUD and on the screen for us. The last one is non-diegetic. This is UI that is not in the game space and it's not in the narrative. It is just buttons that are on the screen on the HUD for us to interact with. We see it in a lot of mobile games that are out, a lot of Facebook games in the past. It's just meant for very, very, very easy access for people to just do the thing they need to do and keep going. With AR, you can do these things. You can have UI just sit on the screen, especially if it's something that's more like taking pictures of any sort of AR elements that are in the world. Lastly, with AR, we do have a special type of interaction that's object related. So if you're pointing your camera at a specific picture, in this case, I'm showing pins. This is a company called Pinfinity Augmented Reality Pins. And you point your camera, maybe using a specific, like a special app, at an object, and the camera detects, or the app detects that object, detects the image that's on there, and then projects any sort of UI or any sort of art or models, VFX, etc. Once it detects that. In this case, on the right, we do have like maybe some sort of animation that starts when we point at the pin. On on the left, and then on the right, we have this whole explanation of what this pin is, who this character is, any sort of stats, and then additional characters associated with that character. So it's giving you more information of this main Cobra Ninja. So what are some UX considerations that you should make for your game and AR as well? Like I mentioned before, this is going to focus mainly on mobile, and maybe once in a while you'll see like a little example of something else, mobile games and AR. And I'm going to try to get as comprehensive as I can, but there are just so many guides out there as to how you can like really truly account for all the considerations on games and AR. For the sake of this talk, I'm going to kind of highlight the main ones, especially when we are talking about user experience and how certain experiences can affect what they're doing in your product. The very, very first one that I have to mention is any sort of device limits, specifically hardware limits. With AR and games, it does take up quite a bit of a mobile phone's capabilities. So there are just some very basic things we need to account for: battery life, the fact that we have data or Wi-Fi, the ability to see things in a 3D, all around you, storage limits, any sort of inputs, outputs. So we do need a smartphone or some sort of device that allows us to interact with the screen, and that has an accelerometer. It has a gyroscope, and it has GPS, depending on if you are playing like geolocation-based games. Some of them do need mics, others don't. Sound is great. And any sort of screen that's very high display and can handle some of the very high quality graphics that some of these games or AR experiences would be showing you. And also, we need to consider that for AR, we do need some sort of camera that does visual tracking or LiDAR. Anything that's going to detect surfaces, that's going to detect light, depth, etc. And many of these experiences do need to measure or map out the area that you're in order to place objects in the AR space, being able to interact with them, being able to throw them, and then having them detect walls. We do need that capability. And it's not just indoors, it's also outdoors. Being able to map the areas around us and create a mesh so that when we do throw things, just like how it's showing here, it is detecting those surfaces and reacts accordingly. We also need some sort of software, again, using LiDAR, that lets us track hand movement, especially if we are using our hands for the experience we're engaging with and showing our hands in like the camera's view. And lastly, any sort of facial tracking. We see this a lot with like, maybe TikTok or Snapchat, being able to like put things on your face and like rainbows coming out of your mouth or something. we need to be able to do that facial tracking in order for those things to work the way that work. And that does need LiDAR. As for software, especially if you are going to develop for AR, there are many, and every day there's more platforms that you can use and development kits that you can use. Adobe Aero is one. Especially I've seen it used a lot for art or just more creative and showing some really beautiful things in the AR space. AR Core is Google's. AR Kit is for Apple. Unity has its own development kit. Niantic had just recently released Lightship, which is their proprietary development kit, and then Snap AR as well. So you can create like, your own little facial models and what you project on people's faces. And lastly, within device limits, there's also the issue of novelty. And thankfully now, as the years have gone by, people are starting to adopt AR more. And, again, like I mentioned with Snapchat, maybe Instagram, TikTok, it's starting to be more part of our social experience and what we share out. But many people have not used AR apps or any AR games before. So it's incredibly important and essential for you to do some proper onboarding every time someone downloads, an app or a platform that they're going to engage with, or any sort of experience that they're going to engage with. With games too, proper onboarding is always incredibly important. But there is that novelty issue of it. The other novelty issue is for a lot of people, when they are using AR products, well, why should I use this AR product? What need is it fulfilling? What problem is it, helping me with or helping me solve? And what's the value or purpose of it? How is it enhancing my life? And they're going to ask those things. And if that's not something you can really describe or really like set out in stone, unfortunately, people are not going to use it. They're going to think it's fun, and then they're just going to put it down, and then that's it. Use it for a little while just to see what it's like, and then that's it. Now, as we're talking about more the player side or the user side of things, like I mentioned before, with UX, especially for myself, we are very player-centered when it comes to design. And I want to emphasize the fact that when we design, that means that we design for people, not systems. A lot of times devs, they focus very much on how do we build this thing? It's really awesome. I've never built it before. Versus who are we building this for? And do they actually need this thing? And you're going to hear me saying that a lot. And it's very important. The sake of building something for building something, I mean, it's cool, but eventually someone's going to use that. Why would they use it for? And what are you helping them accomplish by using the system that you've created? There are many different types of people out there of all ages. And you have to make sure that you build for the people that will use your product. And usually it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all, depending on how old, how young, how engaged they are with new technology or not. They're going to have different experiences or different expectations, or different motivations as to why they engage with these experiences. And design, especially on the UX side and game design side of things, we are looking at any sort of needs, motivations, and values that a product is going to be bringing to the player. And we try to identify that based on the types of players. Player motivation model is a really great starting point. The Bartle's player types as well is a fantastic starting point. It goes in depth and categorizes players depending on the type of play or the type of things that they're looking for when they play. So if I'm a person that really likes, action and excitement and wanting to see like things go boom and whatnot, I am expecting more of that like motivational need for destruction or excitement, or I highly value any sort of like fast pace, anything that's going to surprise me, anything that is going to keep me super, super, super engaged, sometimes with other people as well. So this is a great resource. I definitely recommend checking it out on Quantic Foundry, and checking out their GDC talk as well. The other thing that does help devs quite a bit when they are trying to think about why a user or player is going to need a feature is creating user stories and player goals. And when we create a player goal, this is just the basic formula. You know, I, as a type of player, as a type of user, even as a dev as well, user stories can be adapted to devs. I, as a type of player, want to accomplish something, do a goal, etc., like some sort of goal, so that I can get something out of it for some reason. It could look at, you know, if we look at Pokemon Go, it could look more like I, as a player, I want to protect my Pokemon so that I don't accidentally turn them into candy. It could be sometimes specific. It could be a little more vague. You know, as a social player, I want to be able to communicate with my guild because I want to organize raids. How do we accomplish that? So these are the motivations. These are the things people are looking for and value and need from your product. Now it's up to you to find out how to approach that based on your product, your stakeholders, players that are playing. And together with your team, you sit down, you do brainstorming sessions, you talk, interview with players, do research. Usually you should be spending pre-production time doing this. But this is super great, recommend it for any sort of Jira tickets or Confluence. Anytime you're creating a GDD or any sort of like TDD spec, including these is very, very helpful to keep your team in the mindset of, okay, this is for players. This is for this type of player. What do we need to achieve and how do we achieve that? And then as you're creating it, you tick off like, yeah, we got that. We were able to design for that. As we are also talking about any sort of like physical limitations or any sort of like device requirements, mobile hand placement is going to be incredibly important as well. Different users, depending if they're left-handed or right-handed, if they're children or if they're older, children have smaller hands, adults have bigger hands, they're going to be using phones in different ways. So you need to be very cognizant of how people hold phones, like physically hold phones. And you need to make sure that your product is either matching that or making it as easy as possible for them to hold a phone comfortably while they're playing your game. These are some examples of like different ways people hold their phones. It could be one-handed, it could be two-handed with, you know, one hand behind the phone, the other one with your thumb scrolling around. You could be holding your phone with both hands, either in portrait or landscape mode. And all these green areas, what they're mapping out is the reach of the main action that your thumb would be making, or the main action that, you know, any sort of finger would be taking. So the green is where you really, really want your main call to actions, your any sort of button placement that's going to be, you know, repeated over and over. If you're going to be throwing something in your game, make sure that it's within that green area. Yellow is going to be a little bit harder for them to reach. They kind of have to like, you know, like get across the screen in order to hit that, or they have to reposition their hands in order to tap those screens. And then red is just the absolute like edges of what they can achieve. And they are literally going to reposition their hands in order to get to those areas. You want your players to be comfortable. So try to make it in a way that makes the most use of them staying in the same position and not having to change too often. Games, try to take advantage of this as much as possible. Pokemon Go in the bottom corner, whenever you're throwing a ball, whenever you're interacting with any sort of UI in the game, it's always on the bottom of the screen because you want to make sure that everything is on the bottom, easy to accessible with one hand and one thumb. But some other games because of the way that it's designed, do require you to, use other ways and other hand placement gestures, interactions on the screen. Now, when we talk about AR, it uses the phone somewhat similarly, but it really depends on what it is that you're having a player do in the game. And it also depends on the device, if it's a tablet versus just a smartphone. At minimum, your phone should be used as a viewfinder the way you would use your camera app, or like if you're watching the movie. It should be comfortable with both hands for you to be able to go in and out of any sort of object that's on the floor, or anything you might have placed or created in your environment. But at its ideal, it should be an extension of your hand or a tool that brings the virtual world into the real world. It allows you to move around. It accounts for depth. It accounts for the people around me and tracks them. It lets me draw in VR space and lets me use my hand and tracks my hand in order to accomplish those things. Or in this, like Google Maps, it shows me the directions in the environment, the directions I need to go in. And I'm going to be holding, my phone like this and just following in front of me where it's taking me to go next to my destination. And like I mentioned before, hand tracking is definitely a thing that can be accomplished in AR. So think about like how you can have objects in the game interact with your hand. Maybe it's something that can sit in your hand. Maybe it's something that you can pluck from out of, the ground or a flat surface that it's tracking, or plant. Maybe you can plant a little garden in your AR world. But think about like how you can actually use your hands. And you would be holding your phone in one hand. Think about the placement there, and at the same time tracking your hand in that space. Now I want to talk a little bit about player agency. Agency is the ability for me to control how I do things and the decisions that I make, either in a game or in real life. It's all about agency. One of the main things we want to make sure when we're designing is that we aren't taking control away from the player. If your player is fighting a monster and they're really engaged, making sure that they're making all the right decisions and strategizing, the last thing you want is a tutorial that is going to interrupt what they're doing in order to explain to them how to do a thing. Stop, read this wall of text because it explains to you this button. We don't want to interrupt anything that the player may be doing. So if you do need to tutorialize something, or if you do need to explain to the player how something works, try to do it in a way that they're still engaging with the game and it's not stopping what they're doing currently or in the middle of any sort of action, and not interrupting them at all. I think a really good way that's done is maybe through achievements. Sometimes it shows the amount of, if you're trying to teach a player how to punch, for example, it shows you what button you need to push, but the player can still walk around and run. And every time they press the punch button, it shows you how many more times you need to do that before you're done with that action. And then you can learn the next thing. The other thing you can do, especially if you want your player to be looking into towards a specific area, because again, you want to make sure that they have player agency and can look wherever they want. But if you want them to kind of look towards a specific area, you can either use the environment as a sort of indicator of like, hey, you want to follow this trail of lights and go in this direction because that's your next point in completing your task. Or in the case of Sky, what they do is they very gently reorient your camera towards that next point as the trail is going. I can change my camera direction if I want to, but it is guiding me a little bit towards what I need to do next without directly stopping me and making me go in that direction, literally. Another thing that you can account for is actually, allowing players to give up that control in very meaningful ways. And at the same time, allowing them to disengage whenever they want from giving up their control. So again, in Sky, you have the ability to let another player guide you to your next destination or to any sort of like puzzle or spirit that you may be missing. And what they do is they extend their hand towards you and you accept whether or not you want to hold their hand. And they are the ones that are literally driving. They take you to the next point. You don't have to do anything. You can just peacefully enjoy the experience until you realize, no, I want to do this thing. And then you can disengage and go off and continue your path. And this was an incredible approach to giving up that control. In AR, what we have to always make sure we're aware of and considering is that AR is an extension of our current world. So we don't want to limit where the player is looking or what they want to do. Anything that's going to block any sort of direction I want to look at is going to be not great. If you have an app that only lets the player look up and down, but not left to right, why would you do that to them? And I understand, you want them to be very focused on the thing in front of them, but they're going to be curious. They want to see the world around them. They want to know what's behind them, especially. Part of that is, just safety. They don't want anything springing on them or surprising them, but it is more than often than not curiosity. So let them see. But what you can do, if you really, really want them to focus on a specific item within the world, you can create indicators on the screen. If you tap on an indicator, maybe it will shift your camera over that way. Or the player can naturally look in that direction and then find that object that you want them to interact with or start a tutorial or whatever it is that you need them to do. Another way that you can approach this is through sound. And in this case, sound does tap more into that curiosity aspect, like, oh, I heard that bird in this direction, let me see, let me look and see what that was. And that lets them explore the AR environment a lot more naturally. Haptics is also a really great tool for you to use. If there's something far away from them that maybe they need to be aware of, it could be a low vibration. The closer that it gets, it could be a much more intense vibration. And you can pair this with the visuals that I've explained so far. Another thing that you need to account for with player agency is an accessibility pattern called bypass. It's literally allowing players to skip or bypass part of a game so that they can continue with progress. And there's multiple reasons why you would want to do this. Sometimes players have physical disabilities, and whatever you designed is actually creating a barrier for them from continuing to enjoy the experience. They might have cognitive disabilities. It could be a topic that's very sensitive to them and they actually don't want to engage with that topic. So giving them the option to be like, no, thank you, pass, is really great. And you can do this just as simple as, hey, tap to skip and you don't have to see this, or a skip button that they can just go ahead and tap whenever they like. And it just pushes them all the way to the end of whatever it is that they were just seeing. A game that does this, recent game that did this pretty well, Boyfriend Dungeon, is a narrative-based game, and it's kind of a dungeon crawler. And at the beginning of the game asks you, hey, during this game, a character called Mom is going to be sending you text messages, and they're going to be, very supportive messages and stuff. Is that okay, or would you like us to disable that for you? And what they were considering were more of the psychological aspects of a player. Not everyone may have a great relationship with their parents. So allowing them to be like, I'd rather not, because this can be triggering for me, or triggering for anything that I might be feeling, is great. And this applies to any sort of other narrative choices that your game team has made. It could also apply to graphic content. Especially so many games have very violent and graphic content, a lot of killing and things, that are done to bodies. And many designers decide to keep those in without letting players bypass anything. And your players just kind of stuck there like, oh my God, why won't you let me look away from this? Why can't I just like skip this entirely? I don't like this. And allowing players to actually skip these types of gameplay or narrative choices is actually you making sure you're keeping your players safe. So allow them the choice between whether or not they want to participate or view certain content. All right, going into expectations and interactions. Now we're going to start going more into like the UX part and how we tap on the screen and how we use AR as well. So account for our senses. We have many different senses, not just the standard 5. You all know hearing, sight, touch, smell, taste. Proprioception and vestibular senses have to do with knowing where your body is in the space around you and finding your balance or your center of gravity within understanding your body. Those are additional senses that we have to make sure we're accounting for, especially with AR, and I'll go into why. With AR, we are creating a new mental model for a new type of hybrid environment. For many people, like I mentioned before, it's the first time they're using AR, and they don't really know what to expect. They don't really know how to engage with things and how things are going to react to them engaging with it. So your brain is starting to like see this new environment and being like, oh, these are the expectations I'm starting to create based off of this. But it's really great to still go ahead and leverage what they already understand from the world around them based on sizing and how that object would work or behave. If you have toys that you put on a table in AR, keep them to a similar size than what they would probably expect to see in the real world. If there's a person or a robot or maybe a giant monster in the room with them, keep it proportionate to their point of view and that creature's point of view, or how big and the sizing of that creature is. Same thing if I engage with a fire truck, I'm going to expect, the sirens to go off and go wee, wee, wee all around the table as I move it around. With the robot, maybe it makes some sounds when I poke at it. Maybe it chases me. I don't know. But keeping that to something I would expect as a player will help you keep that object integrity. The environmental fidelity aspect. What is the ideal space for your product? Is it a room with barely anything in it? Is it an open park? Or is it maybe even a museum? And you're pointing your camera around and looking at the different portraits that are in there, and they start coming to life as you look through all these different portraits. So design for the space, the ideal space for your product, and see what you can push there before you start moving into other aspects. Lastly, the other thing you need to consider is physics. Treat objects in AR as if they existed in that space or existed in the real world. Leverage surface detection. If there's a table, if there's like a little stool or a coffee table and I throw a ball, is it going to bounce off the table and go and bounce off the coffee table? Is the gravity correct for what I would expect to see in the real world, or is there less gravity? Is it going to float? Try to keep it closer to what they would expect to happen. Same thing with moving things around in AR. Keep it, flatter along that surface. Sometimes if it meets like a surface that's a little like jagged or something, it might act a little weird. But try to keep things flat and move them the way that you would expect to be able to push them around on flat surfaces. And leverage gestures and interactions they already know from other apps they already use. We all know the pinch to zoom. makes things bigger, smaller, or it lets you look closer at something or farther away. Sliding across the screen, we already know that that's an interaction for us to be able to look at objects on regular apps. So leverage those things. If you do have hand tracking, your best model is literally, your hand being able to grab a cup or a solid object, and use those same gestures and interactions with hand tracking as you would in real life. And, I can move this rock around either by pinching it and just kind of like moving it around, or maybe holding it and moving around. If you do need to use some sort of additional UI element, like in the right image, make it very clear that the player is actually going ahead and selecting that thing by emphasizing the object itself through, in this case, they use a stroke. And also make it very clear where someone can place an item, or how they can place an item before they actually place the item. Any sort of UI that, again, detects the surface. It could be small, a small element, just kind of letting them know, hey, this is, where you can put it down on the floor. External factors. So when we are playing games and when we are playing or using any sort of app products, even though we want to say there's not going to be any distractions around us, there always are, because we live in a world with many distractions. You may be commuting and someone screams over you or runs past you. You might be taking care of your kids and they need your attention, and you were playing your game, but now you have to put that down and see what they need. The world is full of distractions. And even though your product is going to be designed for that ideal setup, your users will not, use these apps in non-ideal environments. So you have to make sure you're keeping them relatively safe and making sure that they are engaging with your products in a very safe way. Not everyone's room is going to be empty, for example. So you'll have a living room full of like chairs and things that I can easily trip over. I might be on my commute and playing a game while I'm sitting down, and I will feel like that sort of forward and backward motion from like the bus stopping or going, or the people around me can be distracting. Or maybe I'm playing a game and crossing a sidewalk, not realizing the traffic that's around me. So you have to account for the fact that your players are just going to pretty much do whatever they want. And you have to take steps to make sure that they stay safe. One of them is very simple, especially if you're in a room with a lot of things, making sure that you're tracking and mapping the space around them, and all the different objects that would appear. When you are mapping things around, make sure you're actually showing, any sort of visualization in the AR world of them going ahead and tracking this entire space. And there are some apps out there that actually do this as part of their onboarding process. They make sure that before you start anything in the game, you map the area, and it shows you a percentage of completion based on the four walls, the ceiling, and the floor. It's visualized the entire way. When there's two states, either it's an X or a circle. Anything that's a circle means that it got tracked. Anything that's an X means that it's still missing, or is about to be tracked. Another way you can approach it is based off recognition of different things around you. The one on the GIF on the far right is actually tracking different types of objects in an environment: the floor, water, trees, buildings, even the sky. And this allows you to know what's around you and what you can engage with and not. And sometimes you can even have things appear in the sky that won't appear anywhere else. The other thing you need to account for, again, playing with other people is always going to impact your player's play session. And also games that you didn't originally think was going to be played like in a moving vehicle, people are definitely going to do it. So account for like anything that's going to keep them safe. Again, if they're driving, having them be unable to interact with certain objects in any sort of like geolocation based game, or limiting those choices, or just letting them know, hey, just in case, you're driving or you're a passenger or you're doing something in the game that's making you go really, really fast. Stay safe, please. The other thing you need to account for is also the fact that, when you are on a bus or a moving vehicle, there's the chance for motion sickness. And that will impact gameplay. It will impact anything that they're experiencing. It could take, for some people, several minutes to come back from motion sickness to several hours or maybe a day. So that's a whole session lost that they're no longer engaging with your product. It's external. There's not much you can do about it, but do consider what you can do to help them through it. Be aware of blocking anything in the real world. This can be very unsafe sometimes for people if you can't see, if you have something in AR that's actually blocking someone coming towards you, or any like car, for example, and just like resizing the actual space that the car is taking up or a person is taking up. This can be very dangerous, especially if I'm walking, again, across a sidewalk or a crosswalk, and I see that there's in AR this object coming towards me, but it's actually a car, and I'm not paying attention to what's in front of me. You need to be very, very mindful and careful of how we design these things. It's super cool. I loved these two different examples, but we have to, again, keep them safe. Respect their personal space. In games, avatars, the characters that we're using or we created based on ourselves, are an extension of ourself in these games. So anything that's going to create uncomfortable feeling based on like how close someone is getting to my character and how persistent they are about getting close to my character is going to affect my gameplay. I want to get away from this situation. This person is just either limiting my movements, or they keep bumping into me or doing specific actions that may be considered rude. Make sure you're accounting for a person's personal space. And in AR, make sure that, size and proximity are going to matter. How big is the object that's going to be in front of me? And how close to me is that object going to appear? It could be very surprising for someone when they open up their app, they set something out, and the object is literally towering over them and above them and looming over them. They're going to want to take a step back because it's too close. This is too much for me. And here's a great example. With Wild and Seek, you have this entire terrain come up from the table, and it's very big. So even when I was recording this, I had to take a giant step back and to be able to, one, see everything that's on the table, and two, when it appeared so close to me that it kind of took me by surprise a little bit. So respecting people's personal space, very, very important. And the last point I want to make today, and the one that I hope out of everything you've heard me say, is the one that you keep in your mind always. Keep your players safe. Keep the people who are using your AR products safe. Don't create situations or designs that is going to make them get hurt, fall, put them, maybe there's something across the street that you want them to see or get to. People get distracted very easily, like I mentioned before, and they won't see a car coming. Try to limit the ways that you are putting them in dangerous situations. And to just kind of recap everything that I've said today, these are like just the main points. You know, understanding the facets of UX, why we approach certain things about products the way that we do, based on usability, credibility, accessibility, etc. Leverage the usability heuristics as a guide for your product, almost like a checklist of the things that you're doing right. You can borrow UI from games or the types of UI from games and apply them to AR as well in the similar fashion, because games are digital worlds. AR is making use of digital worlds and bringing it into real life. It's still, you can still definitely do all of that. Be aware of, any sort of device hardware limitations or human physical limits. One thing that we noticed with AR as well, and I didn't mention it before, with AR, we're constantly holding the phone in front of us like this. And after a while, your hands do get tired and your arms get tired. Or if you're looking down like this all the time with games, your neck is actually putting a lot of strain on you and extra weight on your neck because you're just facing down all the time. So just be aware of how you're designing certain things and account for maybe some breaks, design those into the game, and be aware of those limits. Design with a player first focus, and again, respect their agency and the things that they want to do. Don't take that control away from them or that freedom away from them. See how you can actually keep the agency and design around it. Use interactions and gestures they already know or expect. You don't have to reinvent the wheel, and they don't have to learn something new unnecessarily. It's totally okay to adapt and adopt. And lastly, and I'll say it again, please keep your players safe, both in the game world and what you're designing within your games, as well as the AR world, making sure that physically you are keeping them safe from what you think is amazing and awesome. And you want them to think it's awesome too. Again, this is Coralie, Senior UX Designer, and thank you so much for watching today. I hope you all have a great day.